The blazing sun beat down mercilessly on Death Valley as Captain Maria Rodriguez gripped the controls of her AH-1W Super Cobra attack helicopter. The temperature outside reached a deadly 127 degrees Fahrenheit, making the air shimmer like liquid glass across the barren landscape below. Her radio crackled with urgent voices as she flew over what had become the largest search and rescue operation in Death Valley's history. 3 days earlier, a massive military training exercise had gone terribly wrong. What started as a routine desert survival training mission for 534 Army Rangers had turned into a life-or-death situation when an unexpected sandstorm struck the region. The storm, unlike anything meteorologists had predicted, lasted for 18 hours and completely disoriented the scattered training groups across the vast desert floor. Maria had been stationed at 29 Palms Marine Corps Base when the emergency call came through. The Rangers had been spread across a 50-square-mile area of Death Valley, working in small teams to complete various survival challenges. When the massive wall of sand and dust engulfed the region, visibility dropped to zero. Radio communications failed as the storm's electrical activity interfered with all electronic equipment. The Rangers, trained for combat and survival, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't fight. The sandstorm was followed by an unusual weather pattern that trapped superheated air in the valley. Temperatures soared beyond dangerous levels, and the normal escape routes became impossible to navigate. Many teams had taken shelter in caves and rocky outcroppings, but they were running dangerously low on water supplies. Search teams on foot and in ground vehicles had been deployed immediately after the storm passed, but the extreme heat made ground operations nearly impossible during daylight hours. Several rescue team members had already suffered heat exhaustion, and 2 had been airlifted to hospitals. The clock was ticking, and every hour that passed meant more Rangers were at risk of severe dehydration and heat stroke. Maria's Cobra helicopter was originally designed for combat, not search and rescue operations. The aircraft was built for speed and firepower, not for carrying supplies or evacuating people. But she was one of the most experienced pilots in the unit, and her aircraft was one of the few that could handle the extreme conditions in Death Valley. The thin air and intense heat made flying incredibly challenging, pushing both machine and pilot to their limits. As she surveyed the endless expanse of desert below, Maria could see the scattered remains of equipment and temporary shelters that the storm had destroyed. The landscape looked like an alien world, with twisted rock formations and salt flats stretching to the horizon. Somewhere in this hostile environment, 534 trained soldiers were fighting for their lives against nature itself. The Rescue Command Center had been established at a safe distance from the valley, but even there temperatures were reaching dangerous levels. Rescue coordinators were working around the clock, using satellite imagery and heat-sensing equipment to try to locate the stranded Rangers. But the extreme conditions were affecting even their most advanced technology. Maria's aircraft was equipped with thermal imaging systems, which gave her a significant advantage in the search. She could detect body heat signatures even in the scorching environment, though she had to fly at specific altitudes and speeds to get accurate readings. Every potential sighting had to be investigated, even if it turned out to be a false alarm. The military had never faced a rescue operation of this magnitude in such extreme conditions. Standard protocols were proving inadequate, and commanders were being forced to improvise solutions on the fly. The media had gotten wind of the story, and pressure was mounting from Washington for a successful outcome. But Maria tried to block out the politics and focus on the mission at hand. Her fuel gauges showed she had been flying for nearly 4 hours, pushing the limits of her aircraft's range. The Cobra's engines were working harder in the thin, hot air, consuming fuel at an accelerated rate. She would need to return to base soon for refueling, but every minute spent away from the search area could mean the difference between life and death for the stranded Rangers. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Maria made one more sweep of her assigned search grid. The approaching evening would bring some relief from the heat, but it would also make visual searches much more difficult. Time was running out, and the situation was becoming more desperate by the hour. Through her headset, she could hear the voices of other search aircraft reporting negative results from their assigned areas. Ground teams were preparing for another night of limited operations, knowing that their window for successful rescue was closing rapidly. The weather forecast called for another day of extreme heat, potentially even higher than what they had experienced so far. Maria's hands were steady on the controls despite the stress of the situation. She had trained for years to handle emergency situations, but nothing had prepared her for the scope and urgency of this rescue mission. The lives of 534 Rangers depended on the success of the search and rescue teams, and failure was not an option. As she prepared to make her final pass before returning to base, Maria spotted something that made her heart race. Through the thermal imaging display, she could see what appeared to be a cluster of heat signatures in a rocky canyon that hadn't been thoroughly searched yet. The signatures were faint, but they were definitely there, huddled together in what looked like a desperate attempt to find shade and shelter. She immediately radioed her position to the command center and began a careful descent toward the canyon. This could be the break they had been hoping for, or it could be another false alarm. But as she got closer, the thermal images became clearer, and Maria realized she might have found the first group of stranded Rangers. The real challenge would be figuring out how to get them out of their deadly situation. Maria's heart pounded as she carefully maneuvered her Cobra helicopter closer to the rocky canyon, where the thermal signatures were strongest. The downdraft from her rotors kicked up clouds of dust and sand, temporarily obscuring her view of the ground below. Through the swirling debris, she could make out movement. Among the rocks, definitely human figures, waving frantically at her aircraft. She counted at least 15 Rangers, huddled in whatever shade they could find among the jagged canyon walls. Their uniforms were torn and dirty, and even from her elevated position she could see that several of them were in obvious distress. Some were lying motionless while others struggled to wave pieces of clothing to signal her location. The canyon was narrow and filled with dangerous rock formations that made landing impossible for any aircraft, let alone a military attack helicopter. Maria circled the area several times, studying the terrain and trying to formulate a plan. Her Cobra was designed for combat missions, not rescue operations, and it had no capability to hoist people to safety or carry passengers. Through her radio, she immediately contacted the rescue command center with her discovery. The coordinates were quickly relayed to ground teams, but the nearest rescue vehicles were still hours away due to the difficult terrain. Even worse, the approaching darkness would make ground navigation extremely hazardous in the rocky desert landscape. Commander Sarah Mitchell, the operations lead coordinator, responded over the radio with urgency in her voice. The Rangers Maria had found were from Alpha Company 3rd Battalion. They had been missing for over 60 hours with minimal water supplies. Several members of the group had been showing signs of severe heat exhaustion when they last made radio contact before the storm hit. Maria hovered above the canyon, using her aircraft's powerful spotlight to illuminate the stranded soldiers below. She could see that they had done their best to create makeshift shelters using their equipment and torn pieces of fabric. Some had dug shallow depressions in the sandy canyon floor to escape the direct sunlight, while others had wedged themselves into crevices between the rocks. One of the Rangers was using a mirror to flash signals at her helicopter, indicating that at least some of the group were still alert and thinking tactically. But Maria could also see that several soldiers were lying completely still, which was a troubling sign. Heat stroke victims often became unconscious, and without immediate medical attention, their condition could deteriorate rapidly. The challenge facing Maria was unprecedented. Her attack helicopter could hover and provide reconnaissance, but it couldn't actually extract the stranded Rangers from their precarious location. Standard rescue helicopters with hoist capabilities were back at the main base, but they couldn't operate safely in the extreme heat and thin air conditions that were present in Death Valley. As Maria continued to circle above the canyon, she began to formulate a desperate plan. Her Cobra was equipped with external hardpoints normally used for carrying rockets and ammunition. While completely against regulations and extremely dangerous, she wondered if it might be possible to modify those attachment points to carry emergency supplies to the stranded Rangers. She radioed her idea back to the command center, knowing that it would be met with resistance from safety-conscious commanders. The plan would involve flying back to base, having ground crews jury-rig supply containers to her aircraft's weapon pylons, and then making precision drops into the narrow canyon. It was risky, unconventional, and potentially career-ending if something went wrong. Commander Mitchell's response came back quickly. They were desperate enough to consider any option that might save lives. The medical team had calculated that without water and shade, several of the rangers would likely not survive another full day of extreme heat exposure. Maria's supply drop idea might be their only chance for immediate relief. While Maria flew back toward the base to prepare for the supply mission, other search aircraft continued sweeping different areas of Death Valley. Reports were coming in of additional heat signatures scattered across the desert, suggesting that the 534 rangers were spread over an even wider area than initially estimated. The scope of the disaster was becoming more apparent with each passing hour. Back at the base, mechanics and supply specialists worked frantically to modify Maria's helicopter for the unprecedented supply drop mission. They removed the aircraft's normal weapon systems and attached specially designed containers filled with water, medical supplies, and emergency shelter materials. The modifications were completed in record time, but everyone knew they were venturing into uncharted territory. Weather reports indicated that the next day would bring even more extreme conditions, with temperatures potentially reaching 135 degrees Fahrenheit. This would make the situation critical for all stranded rangers, not just the group Maria had already located. The pressure was mounting to find innovative solutions to an impossible rescue scenario. Maria's fuel tanks were topped off, and her aircraft was loaded with as many supplies as safely possible, while still maintaining flight capability. The weight distribution was carefully calculated to ensure the helicopter could still maneuver effectively in the challenging desert conditions. Every pound of supplies could mean the difference between life and death for the stranded soldiers. As she prepared for takeoff on her supply mission, Maria received updates on the other search efforts. 2 additional groups of rangers had been spotted, but they were in equally inaccessible locations scattered across the hostile desert landscape. The magnitude of the rescue operation was growing, and conventional methods were proving inadequate. The sun was setting as Maria lifted off for her return flight to the canyon where Alpha Company was stranded. The approaching darkness would make the supply drop even more challenging, but it would also provide some relief from the brutal heat for the rangers on the ground. Navigation would be entirely dependent on GPS and thermal imaging systems. Flying through the desert night, Maria could see the lights of the rescue command center in the distance and the scattered headlights of ground vehicles slowly making their way across the treacherous terrain. The entire operation was pushing the limits of what was considered possible in such extreme conditions, but giving up was not an option when so many lives were at stake. As she approached the canyon where the rangers were trapped, Maria began her final preparations for the most important supply drop of her career. Everything had to go perfectly. There would be no second chances in the narrow confines of the rocky canyon, and the lives of 15 soldiers depended on her precision and skill. The canyon looked completely different in the darkness as Maria approached with her heavily loaded Cobra helicopter. Her thermal imaging system showed the rangers below as bright orange shapes against the cool purple background of the desert night. Most of the soldiers had gathered in a tight group, but she could see that several were still lying motionless in the shadows of the rocky walls. Maria switched on her aircraft's powerful searchlight, illuminating the narrow canyon floor with harsh white light. The rangers below immediately began signaling with whatever reflective materials they could find, desperate to guide the supply drop to their exact location. The canyon was only about 60 feet wide at its narrowest point, leaving very little room for error during the drop operation. The modified supply containers, hanging from her aircraft's hardpoints, were clearly visible in her peripheral vision as she maneuvered into position above the stranded soldiers. Each container held carefully packed water bottles, emergency medical supplies, energy bars, and lightweight shelter materials. The total weight was pushing her helicopter's limits, making the aircraft sluggish and difficult to control in the thin desert air. Maria made her first pass over the canyon at a low altitude, studying the wind patterns and identifying the best drop zones where the supplies would have the greatest chance of landing safely near the rangers. The rocky terrain was littered with sharp outcroppings that could easily damage or destroy the supply containers if they landed in the wrong spots. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, the senior non-commissioned officer among the trapped rangers, used hand signals to indicate the locations of the most seriously injured soldiers. From her elevated position, Maria could see that at least 3 rangers appeared to be unconscious, while several others were moving very slowly. Clear signs of advanced heat exhaustion and dehydration, The first supply drop had to be perfect. Maria positioned her helicopter directly above a small clearing in the canyon floor, where the Rangers had cleared away loose rocks and debris. She carefully released the first container, watching as it fell through the darkness toward the waiting soldiers below. The container hit the ground hard but remained intact, and she could see Rangers immediately rushing toward it. Her second pass focused on delivering medical supplies to the area where the most seriously injured soldiers were located. This drop required even more precision, as the target zone was smaller and surrounded by dangerous rock formations. Maria held her breath as she released the container, watching its descent through the beam of her searchlight. The Rangers below worked with remarkable efficiency despite their weakened condition, quickly retrieving the supplies and distributing them among the group. Maria could see them immediately opening water containers and beginning to provide aid to their injured comrades. The relief was visible even from her position high above the canyon floor. But this was only the beginning of what would become the largest and most complex rescue operation in Death Valley's recorded history. Reports were continuing to come in from other search aircraft about additional groups of stranded Rangers scattered across the desert. Each group presented unique challenges that would require innovative solutions and split-second decisions. Maria's radio crackled with updates from the command center. 2 more groups of Rangers had been located, including a particularly large concentration of soldiers trapped in an area known as Devil's Playground, a section of Death Valley notorious for its extreme temperatures and treacherous terrain. This group included nearly 60 Rangers, making it the largest single concentration of stranded soldiers discovered so far. Commander Mitchell's voice came through the radio with new orders. Maria was to proceed immediately to the Devil's Playground area to conduct reconnaissance and determine what resources would be needed for another supply drop operation. Time was critical, as weather forecasts indicated that the next day would bring even more extreme conditions. The flight to Devil's Playground took Maria over some of the most desolate and hostile terrain in North America. The landscape below looked like an alien world, with vast salt flats, twisted rock formations, and sand dunes that seemed to shift and change shape in the darkness. The area had earned its ominous name from early explorers who described it as a place where the devil himself might choose to play. As Maria approached the coordinates where the large group of Rangers had been spotted, her thermal imaging system began picking up an extensive pattern of heat signatures spread across a wide area. The soldiers were not concentrated in a single location like the Canyon group, but were scattered across several square miles of open desert terrain. The situation at Devil's Playground presented entirely different challenges from the Canyon rescue. While the open terrain would make supply drops easier, the scattered nature of the Ranger positions meant that multiple precision drops would be required. Additionally, the lack of natural shelter in the area meant that the soldiers were completely exposed to the extreme desert conditions. Maria began a systematic survey of the area, using her searchlight and thermal imaging to get an accurate count of the stranded Rangers and assess their condition. Many of the soldiers had attempted to create makeshift shelters using their equipment, but the effectiveness of these improvised structures was limited in the harsh environment. Through her aircraft's communication systems, Maria was able to establish direct radio contact with Captain David Chen, the officer commanding the Rangers at Devil's Playground. His voice was hoarse and strained, but he provided a detailed situation report that painted a grim picture of their circumstances. Captain Chen reported that his unit had been caught in the open when the sandstorm struck, with no natural shelter available in their immediate area. They had managed to maintain unit cohesion and establish a defensive perimeter, but water supplies were critically low, and several soldiers were showing severe signs of heat-related illness. 2 Rangers had already lost consciousness and required immediate medical evacuation. The medical situation at Devil's Playground was becoming critical. Unlike the Canyon group, which had some natural protection from the elements, these Rangers had been fully exposed to the brutal desert conditions for over 3 days. The lack of shade and the constantly shifting sand had made it impossible for them to find adequate shelter or conserve their energy. Maria's fuel gauges indicated that she was approaching the limits of her aircraft's range, but she continued her reconnaissance mission to gather as much information as possible before returning to base. The scope of the rescue operation was expanding beyond anything the military had previously attempted, and each new discovery brought fresh challenges and complications. As she prepared to leave Devil's Playground and return to base for refueling and resupply, Maria realized that her unconventional supply drop methods might be the key to saving hundreds of lives. The success of her first mission to the canyon had proven that creative thinking and calculated risks could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles in extreme conditions. Back at the base, the rescue operation had transformed into a massive logistical undertaking, unlike anything the military had ever attempted. Mechanics worked through the night modifying additional aircraft for supply missions, while medical teams prepared emergency treatment protocols for severe heat casualties. The base had become a 24-hour operations center, focused entirely on saving the lives of the stranded Rangers. Maria landed her Cobra just as dawn was breaking over the desert horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The beauty of the sunrise stood in stark contrast to the deadly conditions that awaited another day in Death Valley. Temperatures were already climbing rapidly, and weather forecasters predicted that this would be the hottest day yet. Commander Mitchell met Maria at the aircraft as ground crews immediately began refueling and loading fresh supplies. The successful supply drop to the Canyon Group had provided a template for expanding the operation. But the scattered nature of the Rangers at Devil's Playground would require a completely different approach. Speed and efficiency would be critical as temperatures soared into the danger zone. Intelligence reports indicated that search teams had now located 7 different groups of Rangers scattered across nearly 100 square miles of desert terrain. The total count was approaching 400 of the original 534 soldiers, but that still left over 130 Rangers unaccounted for in the vast wilderness of Death Valley. Each group presented unique challenges that would test the limits of both equipment and human endurance. The largest concentration of Rangers was indeed at Devil's Playground, where Captain Chen's unit of nearly 60 soldiers was fighting for survival in the open desert. But equally concerning were reports of smaller groups trapped in locations that were even more difficult to access. One team of 12 Rangers had been spotted in a deep ravine with walls too steep for any ground approach, while another group was stranded on a mesa with no apparent way down. Maria's aircraft had been fitted with an improved supply delivery system based on lessons learned from her first successful drop. The new setup allowed for more containers and better weight distribution, enabling her to carry larger quantities of water and medical supplies on each mission. Every innovation could mean the difference between life and death for the Rangers below. As Maria prepared for her second major supply mission, reports came in about the condition of the Rangers she had helped the previous night. The Canyon Group was in much better shape after receiving water and medical supplies, but several soldiers still required evacuation to proper medical facilities. The challenge was figuring out how to extract injured personnel from locations that conventional rescue equipment couldn't reach. The heat was already becoming unbearable as Maria took off for Devil's Playground, even though it was still early morning. Her aircraft's engines struggled in the thin, superheated air, and she had to carefully monitor all systems to prevent overheating. The Cobra helicopter was being pushed far beyond its intended operating parameters, but it was performing admirably under the extreme conditions. Flying over Death Valley in the growing heat of the day was like traveling through hell itself. The desert floor shimmered with waves of superheated air that made navigation difficult and created dangerous turbulence for aircraft. Maria had to constantly adjust her altitude and flight path to find stable air currents that would allow for precise supply drops. When she reached Devil's Playground, the situation on the ground had visibly deteriorated since her reconnaissance flight the previous evening. Several Rangers were no longer moving, while others had collapsed into whatever minimal shade they could create using their equipment. Captain Chen's voice over the radio was weaker than before, indicating that even the unit's leadership was being affected by the extreme conditions. Maria's first supply drop targeted the area where the most seriously affected soldiers were located. The containers hit the desert floor and immediately began radiating heat from the sun-baked sand, but the Rangers below moved quickly to retrieve the life-saving water and medical supplies. Every second of exposure to the brutal sun was dangerous, forcing the soldiers to work in short bursts before retreating to whatever shelter they could find. The scattered nature of the Rangers at Devil's Playground required Maria to make multiple precision drops across a wide area. Each approach had to be carefully planned to avoid the dangerous downdrafts and heat thermals that could slam her helicopter into the ground without warning. The margin for error was virtually zero in the extreme flying conditions. During her third supply run of the day, Maria received an urgent radio call from another search aircraft. A group of Rangers had been discovered in critical condition near Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America and one of the hottest places on Earth. The pilot reported that several soldiers appeared to be unconscious, and immediate intervention was required to prevent fatalities. The discovery at Badwater Basin represented a new level of crisis in the rescue operation. The location was notorious for its extreme conditions, with ground temperatures that could exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit during peak heat periods. Any Rangers trapped in that area would be facing conditions that were barely survivable even for trained desert survival experts. Maria's fuel supplies were running low after her extensive operations at Devil's Playground, but she immediately volunteered to investigate the Badwater Basin situation. The other search aircraft lacked the capability to deliver supplies, and every minute of delay could cost lives. She made one final drop at Devil's Playground before heading toward what might be the most challenging rescue of her career. The flight to Badwater Basin took Maria over some of the most extreme terrain in Death Valley. The salt flats stretched endlessly in all directions, creating a blindingly white landscape that reflected and amplified the brutal desert sun. Her aircraft's air conditioning system was struggling to cope with the external heat, and warning lights began appearing on her instrument panel. As she approached the coordinates where the Rangers had been spotted, Maria's thermal imaging system painted a disturbing picture. Multiple heat signatures were visible, but many were stationary in ways that suggested unconsciousness or worse. The Rangers at Badwater Basin were clearly in the most desperate situation yet encountered in the rescue operation. The challenge facing Maria was unprecedented. Landing was impossible due to the soft salt surface and extreme ground temperatures, while the open terrain offered no protection from the brutal conditions. The Rangers below needed immediate help, but conventional rescue methods were completely inadequate for the hostile environment they were trapped in. Through her radio, Maria could hear the controlled urgency in Commander Mitchell's voice as additional resources were mobilized for what was becoming a race against time. The rescue operation had evolved far beyond its original scope, challenging every assumption about what was possible in extreme desert conditions. Maria's innovative supply drop techniques had become the lifeline for hundreds of stranded soldiers, but the situation at Badwater Basin would test her skills and equipment to their absolute limits. The scene at Badwater Basin was more desperate than anything Maria had encountered during the rescue operation. Through her thermal imaging system, she could see 23 Rangers scattered across the brilliant white salt flats, with at least 8 showing no movement at all. The ground temperature readings from her aircraft's sensors showed surface temperatures approaching 180 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe burns within seconds of contact. Sergeant First Class Lisa Park was the senior soldier still conscious among the Badwater group, and her weak voice over the radio painted a grim picture of their situation. The Rangers had been caught in the open when the sandstorm hit, with absolutely no natural shelter available in the flat salt desert. They had tried to create shade using their equipment, but the reflective properties of the salt flats made the heat almost unbearable even in improvised shelters. Maria's aircraft was showing multiple warning indicators as the extreme heat affected its electronic systems and engine performance. The Cobra helicopter was operating well beyond its design limits, but she pushed forward with the most critical supply drop of her career. The Rangers below needed water and medical supplies immediately, or more soldiers would lose consciousness from severe heat stroke. The first supply drop at Badwater Basin required extraordinary precision due to the dangerous ground conditions. The salt surface was deceptively soft in many areas, and supply containers could easily sink into the crystalline mud beneath the white crust. Maria had to identify the most stable landing zones while fighting the violent heat thermals that rose from the superheated desert floor. As her first supply container hit the salt flats, Maria watched through her searchlight beam as Sergeant Park and 2 other Rangers struggled to reach the supplies. The soldiers were moving in short bursts, covering their exposed skin and trying to minimize their contact with the burning ground surface. Their movements were slow and labored, clearly showing the effects of prolonged heat exposure. The medical supplies in Maria's second drop included specialized cooling packs and electrolyte solutions designed for severe heat casualties. As the container landed near the group of unconscious Rangers, she could see Park and her team immediately beginning triage procedures to identify which soldiers needed the most urgent care. Their training was evident even in the extreme circumstances. Through her radio communications, Maria coordinated with the Rescue Command Center to establish a medical evacuation plan for the most critical casualties at Badwater Basin. Traditional helicopter medical evacuation was impossible due to the extreme ground conditions, but innovative solutions were being developed using specialized equipment and modified aircraft. Weather reports indicated that the day's temperatures were still climbing toward what could be record-breaking levels for Death Valley. The heat was becoming so extreme that even Maria's high-altitude position was becoming dangerous, with her aircraft's cooling system struggling to maintain safe operating temperatures. The situation was approaching the absolute limits of what was survivable. During her third supply run to Badwater Basin, Maria received updates on the overall rescue operation that showed both progress and growing challenges. Ground teams had successfully reached 2 of the smaller ranger groups and were conducting evacuations, but the largest concentrations of soldiers remained in locations that were inaccessible to conventional rescue methods. The success of Maria's supply drop operations had inspired other pilots to attempt similar missions, but not all aircraft were capable of operating in the extreme conditions. 2 other helicopters had been forced to abort their missions due to engine overheating, and one had made an emergency landing when its cooling systems failed completely. The Cobra's robust military design was proving crucial to the rescue effort. Captain Chen's group at Devil's Playground was in much better condition following Maria's earlier supply drops, but they still required evacuation before the peak heat of the day made their situation critical again. The challenge was coordinating multiple complex operations while maintaining safety margins that were already stretched to their limits. As Maria prepared for what might be her final supply drop at Badwater Basin, her fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels and multiple aircraft systems were operating in emergency modes. The extreme conditions were taking their toll on both machine and pilot. But the mission was too important to abandon while Rangers were still in mortal danger. Her last supply drop included specialized emergency shelter, materials and additional medical supplies for the soldiers who remained unconscious. Sergeant Park's team had managed to move several casualties into the minimal shade provided by their improvised shelters, but the situation remained critical for at least 6 Rangers who showed no signs of improvement. The thermal imaging from Maria's aircraft revealed that her supply drops had created small pockets of activity around the landing sites, where Rangers were able to access life-saving water and begin treating their injured comrades. But the overall pattern showed how precarious the situation remained, with many soldiers still barely clinging to consciousness in the hostile environment. As she prepared to leave Badwater Basin for refueling and resupply, Maria received an urgent radio transmission about a new development in the rescue operation. Search teams had located the largest group of missing Rangers yet discovered. Nearly 80 soldiers trapped in an area called the Devil's Golf Course, a region known for its jagged rock formations and maze-like terrain. The Devil's Golf Course presented challenges that were different from, but equally dangerous, as the previous rescue sites. The area was characterized by sharp crystalline rock formations that could shred equipment and injure personnel, while the maze-like terrain made navigation extremely difficult even under normal conditions. In the extreme heat, it had become a death trap for the stranded Rangers. Commander Mitchell's voice over the radio carried a new urgency as she briefed Maria on the Devil's Golf Course situation. The Rangers had been located using satellite thermal imaging, but their exact positions were difficult to determine due to the complex terrain that interfered with electronic sensors. Visual reconnaissance would be required before any supply operations could be attempted. Maria's return flight to base took her over terrain that showed the full scope of the rescue operation now underway. Ground vehicles, aircraft, and personnel were scattered across Death Valley in what had become the largest search and rescue operation in the region's history. The sight was both inspiring and sobering, demonstrating the massive effort required to save the stranded Rangers. Back at the base, mechanics and support crews were working frantically to prepare additional aircraft for the expanded rescue mission. Maria's innovative supply drop techniques were being adapted for use by other pilots, But the extreme conditions meant that only the most experienced aviators could safely operate in Death Valley's hostile environment. As Maria landed her overheated and fuel-depleted Cobra helicopter, she knew that the most challenging phase of the rescue operation was just beginning. The discovery of 80 Rangers at the Devil's Golf Course meant that hundreds of soldiers were still trapped in Death Valley's most dangerous locations, and time was running out before the heat became absolutely lethal for everyone involved. The scene at the base had transformed into controlled chaos as the rescue operation reached its most critical phase. Maria's Cobra helicopter was surrounded by mechanics working furiously to repair heat damage and replace overheated components, while she received her briefing on the Devil's Golf Course situation. The clock was ticking relentlessly as ground temperatures across Death Valley soared toward potentially lethal levels. Commander Mitchell spread detailed satellite images across a table in the operations center, pointing to the maze-like terrain where nearly 80 Rangers were trapped among the sharp crystal formations. The Devil's Golf Course was a geological nightmare, with jagged salt deposits and rock formations that created a labyrinth of dead-end passages and hidden crevices where soldiers could easily become lost or injured. The thermal imaging from surveillance aircraft showed that the Rangers at Devil's Golf Course were spread across an area roughly 2 miles square, but their exact positions were difficult to pinpoint due to the complex terrain that interfered with electronic sensors. Many soldiers appeared to be sheltering in narrow crevices between the rock formations, which provided some protection from the sun, but made them nearly impossible to spot from the air. Major Robert Hayes, the commanding officer of the trapped unit at Devil's Golf Course, had managed to maintain sporadic radio contact with the Rescue Command Center. His reports described a desperate situation where soldiers were moving constantly to find shade as the sun's angle changed throughout the day. Several Rangers had suffered injuries from falls on the sharp crystalline surfaces, and medical supplies were completely exhausted. Maria studied the aerial photographs while mechanics completed the emergency repairs to her aircraft. The Devil's Golf Course would require a completely different approach from her previous supply missions. The terrain was too irregular for conventional drops, and the maze-like formations meant that supplies might land in inaccessible locations, even if the drops were accurate. Weather updates continued to paint an increasingly dire picture. Ground temperatures were now exceeding 190 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, with Death Valley experiencing what meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-century heat dome. The extreme conditions were affecting not just the stranded Rangers, but also the rescue equipment and personnel trying to reach them. As Maria prepared for takeoff on what could be the most challenging mission of her career, she received updates on the other rescue sites. The Rangers at Badwater Basin were holding on thanks to her earlier supply drops, but several soldiers remained unconscious and in critical condition. Ground evacuation teams were slowly making progress toward some of the smaller groups, but the largest concentrations of soldiers remained completely dependent on air supply operations. The flight to Devil's Golf Course took Maria over familiar territory that now looked even more hostile in the extreme heat. The desert floor shimmered with heat waves so intense that they created false horizons and optical illusions that made navigation treacherous. Her aircraft's instruments were functioning in emergency modes, with multiple systems showing warning indicators from the prolonged exposure to extreme conditions. When she reached the Devil's Golf Course area, Maria's first challenge was simply locating the trapped Rangers among the complex terrain. The salt formations created a bewildering landscape of white peaks and dark shadows that constantly shifted as the sun moved across the sky. Her thermal imaging system was partially blocked by the rock formations, making it difficult to get clear readings on the soldiers' positions. Flying low over the jagged terrain, Maria began to spot movement in the crevices between the crystal formations. Rangers were waving pieces of fabric and using mirrors to signal her position, but their signals were coming from dozens of different locations scattered throughout the maze-like landscape. The unit had been forced to split into smaller groups to find adequate shelter, making a coordinated supply drop nearly impossible. Major Hayes's voice crackled over the radio with increasing urgency. He reported that the heat was becoming unbearable, even in the shaded areas between the rock formations. The crystalline surfaces were absorbing and radiating heat like giant mirrors, creating an oven-like effect that was slowly cooking the trapped soldiers. Several Rangers had already collapsed from heat exhaustion, and others were showing signs of delirium. Maria's first attempt at a supply drop nearly ended in disaster when violent heat thermals caught her helicopter and slammed it toward the sharp rock formations. She pulled up just in time, her rotor blades clearing the jagged peaks by mere feet. The extreme conditions were making precision flying almost impossible, and any mistake could be fatal for both her and the Rangers below. Realizing that conventional supply drops would be ineffective in the complex terrain, Maria began experimenting with a new technique. She positioned her helicopter above the larger open areas between rock formations and released smaller supply packages that could be retrieved by Rangers willing to make short dashes between shelter points. It was dangerous for the soldiers on the ground, but it was their only chance for survival. The first successful drop landed in a relatively clear area where a group of 8 Rangers had taken shelter. Maria watched through her searchlight as the soldiers took turns making quick runs to retrieve water bottles and medical supplies, spending only seconds in the direct sunlight before retreating to the shade. Their movements were coordinated and disciplined despite their desperate circumstances. As Maria continued her supply operations, reports came in about developments at the other rescue sites. Ground teams had successfully evacuated the canyon group where she had made her first supply drop, but the soldiers at Badwater Basin were in increasingly critical condition. The extreme heat was overwhelming even the emergency medical supplies, and several Rangers were approaching, the point where only immediate hospital care could save their lives. The scope of the rescue operation had grown beyond anything previously attempted in such extreme conditions. Every available aircraft was being pressed into service, with pilots pushing their machines and themselves to the absolute limits of endurance. Maria's Cobra helicopter had become the model for how military aircraft could be adapted for humanitarian missions in impossible environments. During her 3rd hour over Devil's Golf Course, Maria received an emergency radio call that changed everything. Search teams had located the final group of missing Rangers, 47 soldiers trapped in an area called the Devil's Cornfield, a region of Death Valley known for its extreme isolation and complete lack of water sources. This discovery meant that all 534 Rangers had now been accounted for, but it also meant that the rescue operation faced its greatest challenge yet. The Devil's Cornfield was located in one of the most remote and inaccessible areas of Death Valley. Surrounded by soft sand dunes that made ground approach virtually impossible, the Rangers had been missing for over 4 days with no resupply, making their situation the most desperate of all the stranded groups. Immediate action would be required to prevent a catastrophic loss of life. Maria's fuel gauges showed that she was approaching the limits of her aircraft's range, but she volunteered to conduct immediate reconnaissance of the Devil's Cornfield situation. Every minute of delay could cost lives, and her experience with extreme condition flying made her the logical choice for the dangerous mission. The final phase of the rescue operation was about to begin. As she prepared to leave Devil's Golf Course and head toward the Devil's Cornfield, Maria made one last supply drop to Major Hayes' group. The Rangers below had organized themselves with remarkable efficiency, creating a distribution system that allowed supplies to reach even the most isolated soldiers among the rock formations. Their survival instincts and military training were proving crucial in the fight against Death Valley's brutal conditions. The flight toward Devil's Cornfield took Maria over terrain that represented the absolute worst of Death Valley's hostile environment. Sand dunes stretched endlessly in all directions, with no landmarks or reference points to aid navigation. The heat shimmer was so intense that it created multiple false horizons, making it difficult to distinguish between sky and ground. This would be the ultimate test of both her flying skills and her aircraft's capabilities in extreme conditions. The Devil's Cornfield stretched before Maria like an ocean of golden sand dunes punctuated by strange, twisted formations that gave the area its ominous name. Her thermal imaging system immediately detected the heat signatures of 47 Rangers scattered across a wide area, but their positions looked more desperate than anything she had encountered during the 4-day rescue operation. Many soldiers were completely motionless, buried up to their necks in sand to escape the killing heat. First Lieutenant Amy Chen, the senior officer among the Devil's Cornfield group, managed to establish weak radio contact with Maria's aircraft. Her voice was barely a whisper as she described their situation. The Rangers had been without water for over 36 hours and had resorted to burying themselves in the sand. during the hottest parts of the day. Several soldiers had stopped responding entirely, and she feared that some might already be beyond help. The sand dunes presented unique challenges that Maria had not faced at the other rescue sites. The shifting surface made it impossible to predict where supply containers would land, and the fine sand could easily bury critical supplies within minutes. Additionally, the Rangers were so weakened that they might not have the strength to dig for buried containers. Even if they landed nearby, Maria's aircraft was showing severe stress indicators after 4 days of continuous operation in extreme conditions. Warning lights covered her instrument panel, and the engine temperature readings were approaching critical levels. Her Cobra helicopter had performed far beyond its design specifications, but even military-grade equipment had limits when pushed to such extremes. Despite the deteriorating condition of her aircraft, Maria began the most critical supply mission of the entire rescue operation. The Rangers below needed water immediately, and there might not be time for another aircraft to reach them before the peak heat of the day made survival impossible. She carefully selected drop zones on the firmer sand between the larger dunes, hoping to minimize the chances of supplies being buried. Her first supply drop created a small explosion of sand as the container hit the desert floor, but Lieutenant Chen's team immediately began digging toward the impact site. Maria watched through her thermal imaging as the weakened soldiers worked together, taking turns to conserve their energy while excavating the life-saving supplies. Their coordination was remarkable given their desperate condition. The success of the first drop encouraged Maria to attempt a more ambitious supply pattern, targeting multiple locations across the scattered Ranger positions. Each drop required precise navigation through the maze of sand dunes while fighting the violent heat thermals that could slam her helicopter into the ground without warning. The margin for error was virtually zero. As Maria completed her supply operations at Devil's Cornfield, she received the news that everyone involved in the rescue operation had been hoping to hear. Ground evacuation teams had successfully reached the major Ranger concentrations at Devil's Playground and were beginning medical evacuations of the most critical casualties. The combination of air supply operations and ground rescue efforts was finally turning the tide in the desperate battle against Death Valley's brutal conditions. Commander Mitchell's voice over the radio carried a tone of controlled optimism as she updated Maria on the overall status of the rescue operation. All 534 Rangers had been located and were receiving emergency supplies, with evacuation operations underway at multiple sites. The innovative supply drop techniques pioneered by Maria's Cobra helicopter had become the backbone of the entire rescue effort, but the operation was far from over. Weather forecasts indicated that the extreme heat would continue for at least another day, and many Rangers remained in critical condition despite the emergency supplies. The race against time continued as rescue teams worked to evacuate the most seriously affected soldiers before the desert heat could claim any lives. Maria's fuel gauges were now showing emergency levels, and multiple aircraft systems were failing due to the prolonged exposure to extreme conditions. Her Cobra helicopter had pushed far beyond its operational limits, but it had performed magnificently when lives hung in the balance. The aircraft had become a symbol of innovation and determination in the face of seemingly impossible odds. As she prepared for her final approach to the base, Maria received updates on the evacuation progress at all rescue sites. Medical helicopters were successfully lifting out the most critical casualties, while ground teams established secure evacuation routes for soldiers who could travel under their own power. The massive coordination effort was succeeding despite the hostile environment. The base came into view as a welcome sight after the hellish landscape of Death Valley. Ground crews were waiting to receive her battle-damaged aircraft, while medical teams prepared to treat any heat-related injuries among the rescue personnel. The entire operation had pushed everyone and everything to their absolute limits, but they had risen to meet the challenge. Landing her Cobra helicopter for the final time during the rescue operation, Maria was met by Commander Mitchell and a crowd of support personnel who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The successful conclusion of the mission represented a triumph of innovation, determination, and teamwork in the face of nature's most extreme conditions. The final tally showed that all 534 Rangers had been successfully located and supplied, with evacuation operations continuing around the clock until every soldier was safely removed from Death Valley. 23 Rangers required hospitalization for severe heat-related injuries, but remarkably, there had been no fatalities despite the extreme conditions that had persisted for over 4 days. Maria's innovative supply drop techniques using a modified Cobra attack helicopter had revolutionized military thinking about rescue operations in extreme environments. Her willingness to push both herself and her aircraft beyond conventional limits had saved hundreds of lives and demonstrated that creative solutions could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The Death Valley rescue operation became a case study in military innovation and adaptation, showing how individual initiative and technological improvisation could succeed where conventional methods failed. The story of how a female Cobra pilot changed everything would be told and retold throughout the military, inspiring future generations of aviators to think beyond the limitations of their equipment when lives were at stake. In the years that followed, the lessons learned from the Death Valley rescue would lead to new training programs, modified equipment, and improved protocols for extreme environment operations. But the heart of the story remained the same. When 534 Rangers had no way out of Death Valley's death trap, one pilot's determination and innovation had provided the lifeline that brought them all home safely.